Italy is ready to accept a strategy of de-risking, taking steps to avoid that the relationship with China enables Beijing to exercise coercion against Rome. The transatlantic relationship is still the core of the current liberal international order. Italy would probably be less on board with a sharper, more intense, all-out new Cold War.
In what ways is China's influence in Italy most apparent?
Surely it is primarily a trade relationship. China is the second source of import for Italy. The first one is Germany. But it also is a very asymmetrical relationship. China is only the 10th partner for Italy when it comes to export. Therefore, is it primarily an economic issue and a trade issue. It has become also a political influence later on, especially after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding in the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, and therefore at that moment it became a much more contested relationship politically, and then it turned into a major also issue of contention with traditional allies of Italy, primarily the United States and the European Union, that largely warned Italy that the Memorandum of Understanding needed to be considered a political agreement, not just an economic agreement. In fact, the memorandum at the time was presented by the government as primarily an economic issue, while it's been considered both by China and by Italy's partners as something with an important political content.
What makes China an attractive partner for Italy?
Well, it's considered very attractive for a number of reasons. First and foremost is something like an unfulfilled economic promise. For many, China is an unexplored market. So many in the business community and sometimes also in the political community would consider China as a partner that could really help Italy boosting its economic growth, especially when it comes to exports. So there is this idea that the Chinese market could potentially really lift the economic fortunes of the country. In a certain extent, there is a will to imitate Germany and France that are exporting much more than we do manufacturing products to China. So there is this idea of looking for new market and therefore largely not underlining the differences when it comes to values and political regime, but really trying to side more on the economic side. But also the perception of China varies a lot according to domestic politics, that in Italy changes quite rapidly, and of course also according to the wider international context. But especially when we go back to that particularly important moment, that is 2018, 2019. So at the time, Italy had a government led by a populist coalition formed by the Five Star Movement, a populist movement, and the League, which is a right-wing populist party. And they saw a new and more intense relationship with China, not because there was a particularly deep understanding of the future trajectory of China or an alternative understanding of Italian foreign policy, but because they wanted an alternative. They wanted an alternative to the traditional pillars of Italian foreign policy that are what we call here Atlanticism, so a relationship with the United States, and Europeanism, so the relationship with European partners in the European Union. And therefore, China became a sort of possible avenue that particularly the Five Star Movement looked to find an autonomous, more autonomous foreign policy and a source of trade and growth. The League, on the contrary, looked primarily at Moscow. But it was really a domestic development, it was not a different understanding of a role of Italy in the bilateral relationship with China. And therefore, the mood changed quite rapidly when that government and that coalition fell off. We had another government with the Five Star Movement and the center-left party, the Democratic Party. And then we had a grand coalition led by Matteo Draghi, former chairman of the European Central Bank, known to be Europeanist and Atlanticist. So with Draghi, we returned to a more mainstream orthodox foreign policy that entailed an entirely different relationship with China. So a lot of this is an outcome of domestic politics, but also, of course, the reality outside have changed, starting from the Trump administration with the trade war and the emergence of the great power competition between the United States and China. Italy is returning to a more traditional approach, but also is embracing a foreign policy that considers derisking, a concept that comes entirely from the European Commission, the European Union. So we are starting to implement that approach. It's not still clear what it means, but surely the approach is very different compared to 5 years ago, for instance.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Italy?
But the perception is quite different. At a popular level, the perception of China has always been mixed and more negative compared to other European countries. Italy is a country that has been for quite some time in relative economic decline, especially when it comes to export and manufacturing. So many Italians would partially blame China for economic competition that often has been considered unfair, but surely they associate the relative decline of our manufacturing industry not just with globalization, not just with maybe the lack of reforms in Italy, but with unfair competition by China. Lately, the other important element at the popular level has been the pandemic. The first phase, when Italy was hit very badly by the pandemic, there was a sign of solidarity on the Chinese side with the fact that they sent aid and medical equipment. So in the first moment, there was a positive impact for sure. In the longer run, the Italian people started to see that the zero COVID approach in China was particularly harsh and not particularly effective. They saw the aid provided in the first phase as something that was instrumental and used to gain a leverage on Italy. And also the pandemic in general affected the Italian image of China that severely deteriorated. Of course, this was in the same period in which China resorted to economic coercion against other partners, was the moment of the repression of Hong Kong. So in general, in the last years, the perception deteriorated quite sharply. The difference with the elite is quite important, however, because decision makers, business leaders would underline much more geopolitical factors. So the emergence of the great power competition with the United States is surely an important factor. The fact that from Brussels, but especially from Washington, we have a clear message of seeking an alignment when it comes to a China policy, of not trusting a strict relationship with China, because this can entail forms of coercion, can entail risks, can entail dependence, and therefore Italian elites are much more sensible to sort of messages and suggestions that will come from Washington and Brussels.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Italy relationship?
Well, I think Italy is still a valuable partner in terms of values, in terms of shared interest. Italy is a main partner of the European Union, and the transatlantic relationship remains still, together with other partnership with like-minded partners and democracies in Asia, but the transatlantic relationship is still the core of the current liberal international order. Therefore, it's important to maintain a strong and deep relationship with Italy. There are, of course, also economic reasons. Italy is still an economic power in Europe. Italy is at the core of the Mediterranean, and this is important economically, logistically, militarily in a certain way as well. Italy is a very active NATO partner, something that Rome has demonstrated throughout the entire war on terror, for instance. So there are many reasons why Italy as a middle power is important for the United States, and therefore is important to have frank conversations and deep relations when it comes to every important dossier in the world, when it comes to China, but also when it comes to other important relationships like Italy's role in the Middle East, what we call the wider Mediterranean, but also, of course, Italy's contribution, for instance, to the Ukraine war effort against the Russian invasion. This government, as well as Draghi government, decided to contribute economically and sending military aid to Ukraine, something that I think is very important and something that really helped solidifying the relationship with Washington.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Italy?
Italy is ready to accept a strategy of de-risking, so taking steps to avoid that the relationship with China turns into something that enables Beijing to exercise coercion against Rome. Italy would probably be less on board with a sharper, more intense, all-out new Cold War. That would create problems because Italy, in general, the business community, the government, are not ready to give up entirely economic engagement with China. That, again, is the second partner economically when it comes to import, and therefore will be a problem to entirely give up an economic relationship with China. But again, everyone in the West, I think, is trying to grapple with what the risking is and what the risking means. We know it's not entirely decoupling, but we are trying to understand what is strategic, what is essential, and what is not. What kind of economic relationship is suitable for a Western democracy to have with China? What should be protected and what can be allowed to market dynamics? So, for instance, Italy has used quite a lot of control when it comes to foreign direct investments. We have something called Golden Power rule that enables the prime minister to unilaterally block foreign direct investments. It has been used only for Chinese investments. So, for instance, there's a lot of discussion about how to use this new power. It has been used to block the purchase, for instance, of a firm that produces drones. It has used to block another investment that was aimed to purchase a firm that produces luxury yachts. Okay, not directly related to the military, but still some potentially dual-use technology. It has been used also to block the expansion of the ownership of the Pirelli Group. Pirelli Group produces mostly tires. So again, not necessarily military, but maybe dual use. But again, this says that there is a lot of political discussion on what is allowed, what the risking means. I think it's something that still the US government has to grapple with, the European Commission has to grapple with, other Western partners have to sort of assess what are the boundaries and how those boundaries can evolve, and how the Chinese reactions then would stimulate a further discussion and an evolution of this strategy. So I think that is the main issue, avoiding an all-out competition that would seriously damage the economic and somehow political interest of the country. But I think the country is quite ready to sort of rethink the strategy in the direction of de-risking.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Italy?
Again, in this case, probably we have to talk to limits to the competition rather than direct cooperation. Even if areas of direct cooperation can exist, and especially then if we talk about global public goods. Of course, Italy, as every other country in the world, would benefit of policies directed to control climate change. And you cannot have an effective climate governance without both China and the United States. Prevention of pandemic is another. Again, we can make a long list of global public goods. But if we zoom in to the more narrow interest of Italy and the European Union to a certain extent, I would say that limiting the great power competition will be beneficial for Italy. Because Italy benefits from open markets. Italy benefits from a stable liberal international order. Italy benefits, for instance, for a working WTO. And therefore, these are entirely issues that the country deeply cares about and aims at promoting a stable and open environment. I think another important issue and more strategic issue regards the relationship with Russia. So for us, being in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is geographically quite close. So we are ready, of course, to support the Ukraine effort. But there is an issue related to China and Russia. From the American point of view, probably makes sense to sort of lump together China and Russia and try to compete with both. And therefore, it's not that important if China and Russia are sort of pushed on the same side, because there is a strategy of de-risking and competition with China, and there is a strategy, of course, of trying to contrast the expansionism of Russia. From the European point of view, however, it makes sense to try to provide some carrot to China in order to avoid a situation in which China would completely side with Russia and support Russia even more clearly and more substantially with weapons and economic aid. Therefore, I think that this is not perhaps in the front page in Italy, but a bit more at the European level, especially if you go to see Macron's visit to Beijing, in a certain way, Germany's relations with Beijing. So there is an idea, maybe it's naive, but I think it makes somehow sense to provide Beijing with some sort of economic carrot and say, if you don't align yourself with Moscow completely, you still have an open door in Europe, something you don't have in Washington at the moment. But from the European point of view, we don't want to see a Sino-Russian axis. So we try to provide some sort of, again, positive incentive to Beijing to try to prevent them from going all in with Russia. Maybe it's naive, but it is a strategy that I think has been articulated in different capitals in Europe, and is not something that is seen positively in the United States. Macron has been heavily criticized for the visit, maybe for the style as well. Of course, Macron is French, and then he has a particularly Gaullist view of the world in which France needs to be independent from the United States. But in general, from the European perspective, it makes sense to try to do something to separate them rather than push them together, confronting both of them at the same time. So I think this is an issue that should be discussed more between Europeans and Americans, because it's also a geographical perspective and a power difference. So, of course, the United States are looking at Russia as an urgent, immediate challenge, but the long-term challenge to the American position in the world and the liberal international order is definitely China, not Russia. For us, China is somehow geographically far, and therefore we look at Russia as a more urgent threat. But again, this difference leads to probably different perceptions of the relationship between the two, and therefore slightly different strategies when it comes to dealing with Russia and China.